Everyone thought this would be simple. Caitlin Clark gets healthy, steps back onto the court, and everything just resets back to what it was before. The same deep threes, the same impossible passes, the same offense built around her stretching defenses to the breaking point. A clean, predictable comeback story that fans and analysts could follow without thinking too hard about it. But the moment the first real training camp footage started circulating, that entire idea began to fall apart in real time. Because what showed up on the floor didn't look like a player returning from a long absence, trying to rebuild rhythm or cautiously test their body. It looked like something far more advanced than that, like a system that had been quietly upgrading in the background and was now switching back on without any delay. The pace felt different, the decisions came quicker, and the confidence didn't look like it had been rebuilt, it looked like it had been sharpened. And that's where things start to get uncomfortable for the rest of the league, because players coming back from months away usually show small signs of rust that only become obvious when you slow the game down. The reads come a fraction of a second late, the passes are just slightly safer, the shots need a few games to settle in. That's normal, that's expected. But none of those signs are showing up here. The passes aren't just on time, they're early, like she's seeing plays before they even develop. The shots aren't hesitant, they're immediate, taken with the kind of certainty that usually takes weeks to rebuild. It doesn't feel like she's adjusting back to the speed of the game at all. If anything, it feels like the game is struggling to keep up with her pace again, maybe even more than before. And that flips the entire narrative on its head, because now it's no longer about whether she can return to form, it's about whether her form has actually evolved beyond what anyone was expecting. But here's the part that makes this even bigger than just one player. While all the attention was locked onto Caitlin Clark and her recovery, something else was happening quietly in the background, something that didn't generate headlines in the same way, but might end up mattering more. The team around her didn't freeze during those 8 months. It didn't wait for her to come back and then figure things out. It kept building, adjusting, and aligning itself in a way that now looks almost intentional when you see it all together. So what we're watching isn't just a star player returning to her old situation. It's a star player stepping into something that has been restructured to maximize everything she does at the highest level. And that's a completely different scenario than the one people thought they were going to get. Which is why calling this a comeback already feels outdated. A comeback implies picking up where things left off, maybe with a little rust, maybe with a short adjustment period before everything clicks again. But nothing about this feels like picking up where it left off. It feels like stepping into a version of the game that's already moving faster, already more connected, already more dangerous than before. And if that's actually what this is, if this early glimpse is even close to the reality of what's coming, then the rest of the league isn't preparing for a familiar problem returning. They're preparing for something that's been building out of sight and is now ready to show itself all at once. The strangest part about this return isn't that Caitlin Clark looks good again, it's that she doesn't look like she was ever gone. 8 months is a long time in professional basketball, long enough for timing to slip, for instincts to dull, for that split-second decision-making edge to fade just enough that defenses can finally catch up. And that was the real question coming into camp. Not whether her body would hold up, not whether the ankle had healed, but whether the part of her game that made everything else possible, the anticipation, the processing speed, the willingness to act before the window even exists, would still be there. Because that's the part you can't rehab in isolation. That only comes back through real competition, real pressure, real game speed. Or at least that's how it usually works. But what's showing up right now doesn't follow that pattern at all. The reads aren't half-step late, they're immediate. The passes aren't cautious, they're aggressive, threaded into spaces most players wouldn't even attempt to target yet. You can see it in the way she calls for the ball, already knowing where the defense is about to shift, already planning 2 moves ahead before the possession even fully develops. There's no visible hesitation, no moment where she pauses to confirm what she's seeing. It's all happening in one continuous motion, like the time away didn't slow her down, but instead gave her a chance to refine the way she processes the game. And that's what makes this feel different from a typical return, because nothing about it feels like rebuilding. It looks like continuation at full speed.
Even the scoring tells the same story. Players coming back usually ease into their shot selection, working their way back into rhythm with safer looks before expanding their range again. That's not happening here. The deep threes are already back, not as a statement, but as a default. She's taking them early in possessions, off movement, off the dribble, with defenders closing hard, and there's no second guessing in any of it. The confidence isn't being tested, it's already established. And when that kind of confidence shows up this quickly, it forces defenses into impossible decisions. Step up too early, and she's already reading the rotation behind you. Hang back for even a second, and the shot is gone before you can react. And maybe the most telling detail is how everything around her responds. Teammates aren't adjusting to her pace, they're reacting to it, trying to keep up with the speed at which she's already operating. That only happens when a player is fully in control of what they're doing, when there's no internal hesitation slowing things down. It creates this ripple effect, where the entire offense starts to move faster, sharper, more decisively, just because she's on the floor. And that's not something you see from someone who's still finding their way back. That's something you see from someone who never lost it in the first place. Which is why the original question, whether she would return to form, already feels outdated. Because this doesn't look like a player trying to rediscover what made her great. It looks like a player who understood exactly what she needed to protect during those 8 months and made sure none of it slipped. And if that's true, then the idea of a slow adjustment period isn't just unlikely, it might not exist at all. And the wild part is, she already answered all of these questions before she ever stepped into training camp. It just didn't get the level of attention it probably should have. While most people were still debating timelines and wondering how long it would take Caitlin Clark to look like herself again, she quietly showed up in March with Team USA in Puerto Rico, and instead of easing her way back into competitive basketball, she did the exact opposite. There was no minutes restriction mindset, no visible hesitation, no sign that she was treating those games like a warm-up phase. She played like someone who had something to prove, and more importantly, like someone who already knew she didn't need to prove it for very long. What stood out wasn't just the production, it was how she got there. International defenders weren't surprised to see her. They had months to prepare, to study her tendencies, to build specific game plans around slowing her down. And even with that level of focus, she didn't adjust by playing safer or simplifying her game. She leaned into it. The deep shots were still there, taken without hesitation. The passes were still threaded into tight windows that most players wouldn't even consider attempting. And the decision-making, the thing everyone questioned, looked just as fast, just as instinctive as it did before she ever stepped away. That's not something you fake your way through, especially not against disciplined international teams who punish every mistake. By the time the tournament ended, the results said everything that needed to be said. MVP. Not because she slowly worked her way into form, but because she was the best player on the floor from the moment she stepped into that environment. And that completely flips the narrative around her return, because it means the adjustment period people were expecting already happened, or more accurately, never needed to happen at all. She didn't wait for training camp to figure things out. She didn't need preseason reps to rebuild confidence. She handled all of that in real games, under real pressure, against opponents who were actively trying to expose any weakness they could find. Even Stephanie White, who saw it up close as part of the Team USA staff, didn't describe it like a player working her way back. She talked about timing, about letting the game come naturally, things that only show up when a player is completely comfortable at full speed. You can't simulate that in rehab. You can't recreate it in controlled workouts. It either shows up when the lights are on or it doesn't. And for Clark, it showed up immediately. That's the kind of detail that tends to get overlooked in the bigger conversation. But it might be the most important piece of the entire puzzle. Because when she walked into training camp after that, she wasn't trying to prove she belonged at that level again. She had already done that. What she brought with her wasn't uncertainty, it was clarity. A better understanding of her body, a sharper sense of pacing, and a level of confidence that didn't need to be rebuilt from scratch. And when a player reaches that point before the season even begins, it changes the entire timeline of what's possible.
Which leads to the part most people are just starting to realize now. If she already proved she's back, then everything we're seeing in camp isn't the beginning of her return. It's the continuation of something that already started weeks ago and is now carrying over into a system that looks ready to amplify it even further. But the moment that really shifted everything didn't happen on the court. It happened when Kelsey Mitchell made a decision that most players in her position simply don't make. Coming off one of the best seasons of her career, with numbers that put her firmly among the league's elite, and the kind of resume that gives you full control over your future, she had every reason to explore the market. Players at that level don't usually stay still. They test options, they look for bigger deals, better situations, or a clearer path to a title. And if she had done that, half the league would have lined up instantly, ready to offer whatever it took to bring in a scorer of her caliber. That's just how this works. But instead of turning that moment into leverage, she shut the door on it almost immediately. And that decision says more about what's happening in Indiana than any stat line ever could. Because this wasn't about money, at least not in the way people expect. Yes, the contract mattered. Yes, the number was historic for the franchise. But when she talked about why she stayed, the focus wasn't on figures or negotiations. It was on the locker room, the relationships, the feeling that this group had something real building underneath the surface. That's not the kind of answer you give unless you genuinely believe in what's forming around you. And more importantly, it's not the kind of choice you make unless you see a future that's worth betting on right now. That's what makes this move different. It wasn't safe, it was intentional. On the floor, the impact of that decision becomes even clearer. Caitlin Clark and Mitchell don't just coexist, they unlock each other in ways that force defenses into impossible decisions. Mitchell's ability to attack downhill collapses entire defensive schemes, pulling help defenders out of position and opening space that Clark can exploit before it even fully forms. And when teams try to adjust by focusing on Clark, chasing her off screens, throwing extra attention her way, it creates exactly the kind of openings Mitchell thrives in, giving her clear lanes to the basket or clean looks from deep. It's a constant trade-off with no clean solution. Take one away and the other becomes even more dangerous. Try to balance both and you end up stretched too thin to stop either. That kind of chemistry isn't something you gamble with. It's not something you let walk out the door hoping to replace it later. And the fact that both players understand that they recognize how their games fit together at a level most duos never quite reach, is what turns this from a good pairing into something much more serious. There's a level of trust there, an understanding of timing and spacing that doesn't need to be explained mid-possession. It just happens. And when that kind of connection is already in place before the season even begins, it accelerates everything else around it. Which is why this decision feels bigger than just keeping a key player. It set the tone for everything that followed. It signaled to the rest of the roster and to the rest of the league that this wasn't a team waiting to see what might happen. This was a team choosing a direction and committing to it fully. And once that kind of commitment becomes visible, it has a way of pulling everything else into alignment. And that's where things start to feel unusual, because it didn't stop with one decision. Once Kelsey Mitchell stayed, you would normally expect at least a few pieces around her to test their value elsewhere. That's how this league works. Role players who prove they can shoot, defend, and fit into winning systems usually cash in the moment they get the chance. But instead of seeing pieces scatter, the opposite happened. Lexi Hall came back, Sophie Cunningham came back, and neither of those decisions was automatic. Both had real market value. Both had reasons to explore bigger roles or longer-term security somewhere else, and both chose to stay anyway. That's not normal behavior for a roster that hasn't won anything yet. That's behavior you usually see from teams that are already on the edge of something bigger.
And when you listen to how they talk about it, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. It's not framed like a business decision. It's framed like something personal. Words like home start showing up. References to chemistry, to comfort, to believing in the group rather than just the opportunity. That kind of language doesn't come from a team that's still figuring itself out. It comes from a team that already knows what it is and is choosing to protect it. Because make no mistake, players at this level understand timing. They know when to maximize their value, when to secure long-term deals, when to prioritize stability over uncertainty. So when multiple players pass on those opportunities at the same time, it tells you they're seeing something internally that outweighs everything they could gain elsewhere. On the court, that collective decision creates something defenses hate dealing with: continuity. Hull's ability to stretch the floor and guard multiple positions, Cunningham's shooting bursts and spacing, Mitchell's scoring pressure, all of it stays intact around Caitlin Clark instead of being reset or reconfigured. That means the offense doesn't need to be rebuilt or retaught. The spacing is already understood, the timing is already there. Every player knows where the next option is before the ball even moves. And when you combine that kind of familiarity with a player like Clark, who thrives on quick decisions and instant reads, it turns every possession into a chain reaction that's almost impossible to disrupt without overcommitting somewhere else. But what really makes this rare is the risk they're all quietly taking together. Choosing to stay in a situation like this isn't just about belief, it's about betting on the outcome. Because if it works, they're part of something that elevates everyone involved. But if it doesn't, they've all passed up opportunities they can't easily get back. And yet, none of them hesitated. That's the part that stands out the most. There's a level of shared confidence here that you don't usually see unless something behind the scenes has already convinced them this is worth it. And when a roster reaches that point, when players stop thinking individually and start moving in the same direction without needing to be convinced, it changes the ceiling of what that team can become. Because now it's not just about talent anymore, it's about alignment. And once that alignment locks in, everything else starts to accelerate faster than anyone on the outside expects. And then came the move that made it impossible to ignore where this was all heading. Aaliyah Boston didn't just sign an extension, she reset the scale of what Indiana believes this team can become. A historic deal, the kind that immediately tells you this isn't about rewarding what she's already done, it's about locking in what the franchise is convinced she's about to become. At just 24 years old, that kind of commitment isn't cautious, it's a statement. It says the Fever aren't waiting to see if this core works, they're building around it as if the outcome is already clear. And when a team makes that level of investment this early in their career, it shifts everything, because now every decision around it is made with a long-term vision already in place. What makes it even more interesting is that Boston's impact doesn't always scream for attention the way a highlight play does. She's not built on viral moments or flashy sequences that dominate social media. Her value shows up in the possessions that don't trend, the defensive switches that stop an action before it develops, the rebounds secured through contact when everyone else is out of position, the ability to catch difficult passes in traffic and still finish the play without hesitation. She's the kind of player who stabilizes everything, the one who makes high-risk offense possible because there's always something reliable anchoring it underneath. And for a player like Caitlin Clark, that kind of presence isn't just helpful, it's essential. It allows her to push boundaries, to attempt passes and plays most players wouldn't risk, knowing there's someone inside who can handle whatever comes her way. But the real reason this deal changes everything is what it unlocks going forward. Because Boston hasn't hit her ceiling yet, that's the part the contract is really betting on. Analysts keep pointing to her perimeter game as the next evolution, and if that piece starts to develop consistently, the entire structure of this offense becomes almost impossible to solve. You already have perimeter pressure from multiple shooters. You already have a playmaker who forces defenses to react early. Add a front-court anchor who can stretch the floor on top of everything else she does, and suddenly there's no safe coverage left. Collapse inside, and the shooters are wide open. Stay attached to the perimeter, and Boston has space to dominate in the paint. Every option leads to another problem. And just as important as the skill set is the choice itself. Boston didn't drag this out, didn't test every possible offer or create uncertainty around her future. She committed quickly, decisively, in a way that mirrors everything the rest of the roster has been doing. That consistency matters because it reinforces the same message from a different angle. This isn't a group waiting to see how things play out. It's a group choosing to build something together before the results fully arrive. And when your franchise cornerstone makes that decision this early in their career, it gives the entire organization a level of stability most teams spend years trying to create. Which is why this moment feels bigger than just a contract. It's the point where belief turns into structure, where potential turns into a plan that's already in motion. And once that kind of foundation is locked in, everything else starts to form around it much faster than anyone expects.
But for all the excitement around the talent, there was one moment that forced everyone inside the organization to confront a much less comfortable truth. When the lights got brighter and the game slowed down, this team wasn't ready for what playoff basketball actually demands. The matchup with the Las Vegas Aces didn't just end their run, it exposed exactly where things broke down. Because once the pace tightened and every possession turned into a physical battle, Indiana didn't have an answer. It wasn't about skill at that point. It wasn't about shot making or spacing. It was about strength, presence, and the ability to hold ground when the game stopped being pretty. And in those moments, the difference was obvious. You could see it in the fourth quarters, where possessions got messy and every rebound felt contested before the shot even went up. The Aces didn't just execute better, they imposed themselves. They made every drive harder, every catch more uncomfortable, every trip into the paint something you had to fight through instead of glide into. And Indiana, for all its offensive firepower, didn't have enough resistance to push back at that level. There wasn't a consistent presence that could absorb contact, disrupt rhythm, and make opponents think twice about attacking the rim. And when that gap shows up in a playoff series, it doesn't stay hidden for long. It becomes the thing everything revolves around. That's the part that often gets overlooked when people talk about young teams needing experience. It's not just about learning how to execute under pressure. It's about having the physical identity to survive when execution alone isn't enough. When the whistle gets tighter, when defenders get more aggressive, when space disappears, and every action has to be earned, not given. Indiana had the skill to compete, but they didn't yet have the edge to control those moments. And against a team like Las Vegas, that difference isn't subtle, it's decisive. Inside the organization, that wasn't treated like a minor flaw or something that could be patched over with small adjustments. It was recognized as the defining weakness that separated them from real contention. And that's where Stephanie White enters the picture in a much bigger way. Because she didn't approach the offseason thinking about tweaks or incremental improvements, she approached it like a problem that needed a complete solution. The kind of solution that changes how a team feels to play against, not just how it looks on paper. And once you identify a weakness that clearly, the next step becomes obvious. You don't just hope it improves, you go out and build directly against it. You add players who can handle contact, who bring energy without losing structure, who are comfortable operating in the exact situations that exposed you before. Because if that same problem shows up again in the next postseason, then nothing else you've built really matters. And that's exactly why what came next wasn't random. It wasn't just adding depth or filling roles. It was targeted, intentional, and built around one idea, making sure that when the game slows down again, when things get physical again, this time Indiana doesn't fold. This time they push back. And this is where the shift becomes impossible to ignore, because the players Indiana brought in weren't just upgrades, they were answers. Every addition feels like it was selected to fix something specific that broke down when it mattered most. And when you look at how Monique Billings and Myisha Hines-Allen fit into this roster, you can see exactly what Stephanie White was building toward. This isn't about adding talent for the sake of it. It's about changing how this team functions when the game gets uncomfortable. Billings, in particular, feels like a piece that was almost designed for this system. She brings constant motion, running the floor hard in transition, staying active without clogging the paint, and finishing plays decisively when the ball finds her near the rim.
That matters more than it sounds, because with Caitlin Clark pushing pace and making early reads, the players around her have to react instantly. There's no time to hesitate or think through the play. Billings fits that rhythm naturally. She doesn't need touches to stay engaged, she doesn't slow possessions down, and she thrives in the exact kind of chaos that Clark creates. And maybe the most important detail, this isn't a brand new connection. They've already shared the floor in Team USA settings, which means that awkward adjustment period most new additions go through simply doesn't exist here. She steps in already understanding the tempo, already recognizing where the ball is coming from and when. Then there's Hines Allen, and this is where the identity shift really takes shape. Because what she brings isn't subtle, it's physical, direct, and impossible to ignore. She's the kind of player who changes how opponents feel over the course of a game, not just how they play. Every drive into the paint comes with contact, every post touch becomes a battle, and over time, that wears teams down in ways that don't always show up in the box score, but become obvious in the final minutes when legs get heavy and decisions get slower. That was the exact environment Indiana struggled in before. Now they have someone who thrives in it, someone who doesn't just absorb pressure, but applies it right back. And what makes these additions even more effective is how they protect the players already in place. Hines Allen takes on the physical burden that would otherwise fall entirely on Aaliyah Boston, which means Boston can stay fresh deeper into games and focus on being dominant when it matters most. Billings complements that by adding energy and movement without disrupting spacing, giving the offense another layer without taking anything away. It's not just about adding pieces, it's about balancing the entire structure so no single player is forced into doing everything.
That's how identity changes in a real way. Not through one big move, but through multiple decisions that all point in the same direction. The 2025 version of this team could score, could create highlights, could push pace, but when things got physical, it didn't always hold up. The 2026 version is being built to handle both sides of that equation at the same time. Speed and force, skill and resistance, flash and toughness. And when those elements finally exist together in the same system, it creates something that's much harder to game plan against. Because now, it's not just about stopping what Indiana wants to do offensively, it's about dealing with how they respond when you try to take it away. And that's a completely different challenge, one that most teams won't fully understand until they're already in the middle of it. And just when everything started to look too aligned, too clean, too perfect, the internet tried to create a problem anyway. The moment Raven Johnson was drafted, a certain narrative was already waiting to be pushed. Old college rivalries, past matchups, emotional games that fans hadn't forgotten, people were ready to believe there was tension before she even stepped into the building. And then it took exactly one short training camp clip to set everything off. A quick moment where she appeared to walk past Caitlin Clark without acknowledging a high five, and suddenly timelines were filled with speculation. Posts, screenshots, slow-motion breakdowns, all trying to turn a split-second interaction into a full-blown locker room issue. Now, to be fair, this is how these things usually spiral. Fans fill in gaps with assumptions, and once a narrative starts moving, it doesn't really need evidence to keep going. Rumors suggest there could be underlying tension. Some claimed the rivalry never really ended. Others were convinced this was just the first visible crack. But none of that came from inside the team. It all came from the outside looking in, trying to connect dots that were never actually there. And the people who were actually in that locker room shut it down almost immediately. Aaliyah Boston addressed it directly, making it clear that what fans were building up had nothing to do with reality. Both Clark and Johnson echoed the same message. What happened in college stayed in college. No leftover issues, no hidden tension, no ongoing conflict. Just a new team, a new environment, and a group of players focused on winning. And that response matters because it didn't come off defensive or forced. It came off casual, almost dismissive, like they couldn't believe it had turned into a story in the first place. Meanwhile, what Johnson actually brings to the floor is the exact opposite of drama. Her impact is quiet but disruptive in the best way. pressuring the ball, forcing turnovers, creating defensive pressure without constantly fouling. That kind of discipline is rare, especially for a young player stepping into a new system, and it fits perfectly with what Stephanie White is trying to build. This isn't about personalities clashing, it's about roles being filled. And Johnson's role is clear from day one. Bring energy, bring defense, and learn quickly from a roster that already knows how it wants to play. Then there's the upside piece that hasn't fully hit yet. Justine Pissard might not be a headline name right now, but the physical tools alone are enough to get attention. Length, size, and the ability to contest shots in ways most players can't. It's the kind of profile that doesn't need immediate production to matter. And early glimpses in camp suggest there's more there than people expected, especially on the defensive end, where that reach starts to disrupt passing lanes and alter shots at the rim. It's raw, but it's real. And when you zoom out, that's what makes this entire drama narrative feel so misplaced. While the outside world was trying to manufacture tension, the actual story was about fit, about how each new piece slots into a system that already knows what it wants to be. Because teams that are truly locked in don't get thrown off by moments like that. They move past them instantly because they were never real problems to begin with. Which, in a strange way, might be the clearest sign yet of how connected this group actually is. Because when the biggest distraction people can find doesn't even last a full day inside the locker room, it usually means there isn't much to break in the first place. And this is the point where the conversation has to shift. Because focusing on individual players, even stars, starts to miss what's actually forming here. The real story isn't just Caitlin Clark playing at a high level, or the roster retaining key pieces, or even the additions fixing last year's weaknesses. It's how all of those elements are being pulled into something structured, something intentional, a system that dictates how the game is played on both ends of the floor. That's the difference between a talented team and a dangerous one. Talent wins games, systems win when everything else gets tight. You can already see the outline of it taking shape. Offensively, it starts with pace, pushing early, forcing defenses into scramble situations before they're set. That's where Clark's vision becomes almost unfair, because she doesn't just react to openings, she creates them by speeding everything up. Add in the spacing from shooters like Kelsey Mitchell, Lexi Hull, and Sophie Cunningham, and suddenly the floor stretches in every direction. There's no safe help position, no easy rotation that covers everything. And when defenders start hesitating just for a second, that's when the system does its damage. Because every hesitation leads to a pass, a cut, or a shot that comes faster than expected.
But what makes this different from last season is what's happening on the other end. Stephanie White isn't just asking for improvement defensively, she's setting a standard, top 3 in the league, not as a stretch goal, but as the baseline expectation. And that changes how everything is approached. Transition defense is being drilled early, communication is constant, and the new additions, players like Monique Billings and Maisha Hines-Allen, aren't just filling gaps, they're reinforcing an identity built around pressure, physicality, and awareness. Add in perimeter disruption from Raven Johnson, and suddenly the defensive side isn't a weakness to manage, it's a strength that fuels everything else. That's where the system really separates itself. Defense creates stops, stops create pace, and pace feeds directly into the offense that Clark controls. It becomes a loop, one that keeps building momentum the longer the game goes on. Opponents aren't just dealing with one challenge, they're dealing with layers of pressure that stack on top of each other. Try to slow the pace, and the defense tightens up. Try to speed it up, and the offense becomes even more dangerous. There isn't a comfortable option anymore. And when you combine that with continuity, players who already understand each other, who don't need time to figure out spacing or timing, it removes one of the biggest obstacles most teams face. There's no adjustment period here, no early season confusion about roles. Everyone knows where they fit, and more importantly, how that fit contributes to the bigger picture. That's what allows a system to operate cleanly, without hesitation, without wasted possessions. At that point, you're no longer just evaluating talent on paper. You're looking at something that functions as a whole, where every piece amplifies the others instead of competing for space. And teams like that don't usually reveal themselves slowly. Once they click, they tend to accelerate quickly because there's nothing holding them back internally. Which is why the focus is starting to shift away from individual performances and towards something bigger. Because if this system continues to develop the way it's trending right now, then the question won't be how good this team can be. It'll be how many ways they can force opponents into situations they simply aren't built to handle. And that's where this stops feeling like a projection and starts feeling like a warning. Because if you step back and look at everything together, the way Caitlin Clark has returned without hesitation, the way Kelsey Mitchell chose to stay when she didn't have to, the way Aaliyah Boston locked in as the long-term anchor, and how the rest of the roster aligned around a shared direction, it doesn't read like a team hoping things come together. It reads like a team that already knows what it's building. And once that kind of clarity sets in, results tend to follow faster than anyone on the outside expects. Because the truth is, most teams spend years trying to reach this point. They cycle through lineups, test combinations, adjust identities, all while searching for the balance between talent, chemistry, and purpose. And sometimes they never fully find it. But Indiana isn't moving like a team stuck in that process anymore. The pieces aren't fighting for space, they're fitting into it. The roles aren't being questioned, they're being executed. And the system isn't theoretical, it's already showing signs of working in real time. That's the part that changes the timeline, because once a team skips past uncertainty and lands directly in alignment, the usual growing pains don't last very long. And that's what makes this feel different from every promising roster we've seen before. This isn't just upside or potential waiting to be realized. It's structure, continuity, and identity all hitting at once. Offensively, they can stretch you in ways that force impossible decisions. Defensively, they're building toward a level of resistance that doesn't break under pressure. And mentally, they're moving like a group that is already committed to the outcome instead of hoping for it. That combination doesn't just make a team good, it makes them difficult to stop once momentum starts building. So when the season reaches the point where everything slows down, when rotations tighten, when every possession matters, when the margin for error disappears, that's when the real answer shows up. Not in highlights, not in early season runs, but in those moments where games are decided by control, composure, and execution under pressure. And if this version of Indiana holds together the way it looks like it might, then those are exactly the situations they've been preparing for all along. Which leads to a much simpler, much more uncomfortable question for the rest of the league. Not how good can they be, because that part is already starting to reveal itself. The real question is whether anyone is actually equipped to stop it once it fully clicks. Because if everything we've seen so far is real, then this isn't just a team on the rise, it's a team arriving all at once. And by the time that becomes obvious to everyone, it might be already too late to do anything about it.